I note that everybody has really misrepresented themselves. So for example, Joe Newhouse lists himself as a membership in Harvard Medical School, but he actually has 3 other affiliations at Harvard University, more than most people I know. And prior to Harvard, he was a leader in economics and policy at the Rand Corporation. Ashish lists himself at the School of Public Health, which is kind of true, but it's also leading a rethinking of how we are going to be delivering medicine at the international scale, and has his own institute, which he may or may not tell you about, at Harvard University, working on this. Gail works as a consultant, worked with biotech, and also has been, unfortunately, a patient in this space. And Carrie has been on the forefront of the popularization of a lot of the life sciences and biomedicine for her very popular site, and now on the air at BUR, Common Health. But I can tell you, since she's a longtime friend, she understands the issues very, very deeply around the science of genomics and how it impacts medicine, and she's always falsely modest about it. Nonetheless, she will represent the, quote, public view of this. And so, Ashish, you're listed as moderator. Are you willing to take that on?
I am.
So please take it away.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So I was going to do quick introductions of the panel, but I will not, because Zach actually did a much better job than I would have. And one of the things that happens is people get more distinguished, their bios get longer, and the introductions get shorter. And so I think you have the full bios of everybody. And the way we're going to do this is each of us is going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. We decided to go with the no slides rule, which I'm hoping everybody will enjoy. We'll start off with Carrie. We'll go to Gail next. Then we'll go to Joe, and then I will wrap up. Then we'll do some question and answers amongst us, amongst the panel, and then we'll open it up to everybody. So that's going to be the next hour and a half or so. And Carrie, you want to get us started?
Yes, thank you, Ashish. So, hello, everybody. I'm reminded of, you know that horrible nightmare you have, an anxiety dream where you're in a test room and you realize that you forgot to take the course or you forgot to do any of the reading? So that's how I feel now, but it's sort of like, I forgot to get my MD, PhD, my MBA. But I think that I can actually bring some value here in terms of representing both the very general public and also the media, where I've been marinating intensively for the last 30 years or so. So in terms of the general public first, I think to give you the very broad picture, I'd like to give you 3 quick data points. One is that last week, NPR was doing a series on science, and an extremely intelligent and ridiculously well-informed host pronounced the word genomics. And I thought, that's like nuclear. But then I realized it's simply because this is not on the general public radar screen. It is just, in this room, it's the topic that may dominate your life, but to the general public, this is an area that is not truly ready for prime time yet. And this was borne out. There was a poll in February by STAT, which is the new health and science website that's being bankrolled by John Henry, the billionaire. So they did a poll, and what they found was that only 50% of Americans say they have heard or read about genetic testing. Only 6% of adults had actually undergone genetic testing, and most of them were worried about their children's health. And then a survey of physicians offered some clues about why people were not exactly embracing genetic tests, so the doctors weren't either, right? Sermo did a study, and they found that only 27% had recommended that a patient get their genome sequenced, and they were lukewarm about it because they just thought family medical histories were better and more informative and more reliable as a possible predictor of disease, of significant disease. So basically, the broad picture is, the clinical benefits aren't clear, the benefits to the public are not clear, so there's a very high level of indifference and ignorance. And so if the question is what's driving precision medicine, the answer is very clearly not the general public. Spoken broadly, although Gail may have some different things to say about the very large community of cancer survivors. Okay, and then just one other data point. In the last few years, we've seen the Obama administration come out with several big scientific initiatives, most recently the Cancer Moonshot, before that the Brain Initiative, and I would say that the Precision Medicine Initiative just kind of went plunk, right? Like the other initiatives have brought a lot of public discussion and enthusiasm. The Precision Medicine Initiative, it brought a little bit of inside baseball debate, but otherwise it sort of escaped notice. So there's this disconnect between, I would say, the rare disease community, which is hugely invested in precision medicine, and the broader public. Okay, so that's the general public point of view, and I think it's important when we consider social decisions about precision medicine, money to spend, and so on. Okay, second area is the media. So I bring you some news actually just from yesterday, hot off the presses, as we used to say, some of us remember. There was a paper in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings on using precision medicine to tailor treatments for depression. Did anybody see that by any chance? No. So basically it was saying that you could use a couple of genetic tests to predict how people would respond to SSRIs, which sounds great, right? It's like developing pharmacogenetic prescription guidelines. It sounds useful. And the conclusion of the paper reads, with the continuous decrease in the cost of genetic testing, the willingness of insurance companies to cover such tests, and the increase in published data providing more robust evidence of clinical importance, this genotyping, CYP2D6, might become, in the near future, a routine test before prescribing relevant antidepressants to all patients. So my reaction was, all patients, that's like, what is it, like 10% of Americans are on antidepressants? That's a market of tens of millions of people. I smell a market, right? And then you read in the paper a conflict of interest note. Mayo Clinic has a financial interest in Assurex Health, Inc., and the technology referenced in this article. So it turns out, if you haven't heard of it, Assurex is a pretty big company that sells a suite of genetic tests called GeneSight. And that brings me to what for me, is the biggest, I think, public concern about what's driving precision medicine. And that is that here in our American system, where healthcare is not just big business, but huge, booming, possibly in a bubble, multi-trillion-dollar in business, what's driving precision medicine is, of course, at least in part, money. So here I'd like to channel my friend Beth Daly, who's a very distinguished reporter here in Boston. She's been doing some really interesting reporting on precision medicine and mostly looking very skeptically at diagnostics. And she had a big story late last year under the headline, "Genetic Tests for Psychiatric Drugs Spur Hope, Doubts." And the subhead was, "Business unregulated and science often thin, critics say." So it opens with the story of a Vermont man named John Brown, who had very serious mental illness, and his psychiatrist offered him a test from the very company that's in this Mayo paper. It's a GeneSight test. And Beth notes that the test costs $3,800, and the test results prompted his psychiatrist to switch him to a different drug. 3 weeks later, Brown was suicidal and hospitalized. Now, it's only an anecdote, it's true. But Beth writes, genetic tests to identify the most effective psychiatric drugs are the hot new technology in the race to create personalized treatments based on people's DNA. More than 600,000 of these tests have likely been administered in the last 3 years, based on websites and data and so on. And the federal Medicaid program last year agreed for the first time to pay for the GeneSight test for some depressed patients. And then Beth's investigation found that virtually all the evidence that these psychiatric tests work was based on limited studies funded by the companies themselves or researchers they fund, including all 5 studies used to promote GeneSight on the company's website. And she says the federal government doesn't require companies to prove that this and other genetic tests are accurate before marketing and selling them. So unlike drugs, the FDA does not regulate them, although this may change. And she quotes a Stanford bioethicist saying that it's the Wild West on this stuff. And there's very little published evidence on the fact on whether these drug response tests are actually effective. And she also quotes Eric Lander from the Broad Institute, who wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine that the mental health testing company claims are, quote, not harmless and may be quite dangerous. So this is not to detract from the amazing work that's going on to advance genomics and to apply it in medicine. And I have to admit that even though I'm supposed to be an objective journalist, I'm a just hopeless fangirl of this science. And it gives me chills when I read in the book *Sapiens*, which is a great book, that this moment in human history is unique because we are gaining control of evolution directly in a way that we never have before. But I think that it's important to raise the question of money and whether it may drive or distort precision medicine. And so to conclude, I would say that I see 2 immediate questions for possible discussion. One is, do we need better regulation or different regulation for precision medicine as it begins to reach patients and their payers? I suspect later speakers will have something to say on that. And also, I think it might be worth talking about the importance of distinguishing between truly patient-driven precision medicine like Karen Ayash's amazing Lysogene and the work that they're doing, and what may actually be more money-driven. And the example that comes to mind is, it's not directly germane to precision medicine, but a few months ago there was a great big fuss over the female Viagra, the little pink pill, and it sort of seemed to be patient-driven, but then it turned out that those patients were very heavily funded by the drug maker. And so I think that also is just an important point. What is actually patients and what is actually money?
Great. I'll continue on, and it's actually a perfect lead-in because I worked in the Wild West as a first CEO of a diagnostic lab that was doing molecular testing, although not on psychiatric patients, but in the cancer space. And ironically, while I was leading that company, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So I had the opportunity to experience it kind of both through the eyes of the money wheel of how do you run a lab and what do you do, as well as that of a patient who might or might not benefit from some of the precision medicine work that was going on. Now, I was fairly fortunate. My cancer was stage 2 ER, PR, and HER2 positive. And I think had I been triple negative, I would probably have a different view. I was tested with Oncotype DX, which is was one of the first precision medicine tests, as well as BRCA1 and 2, although before the Angelina Jolie effect. And I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, so there was a reason to do it. A lot of patients don't understand that test really only applies in a certain set of circumstances. And despite the fact that I was negative, the day I finished my treatment, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Wow. So, again, it's only a portion of the population that applies to, and that doesn't mean the rest of your family will therefore be cancer-free. So, I'm also a healthcare insider because I spent the first half of my career on the payer side. So I was the one making some of the decisions about what we will or won't reimburse for, which is one of the biggest challenges as a patient that you face. So one of the questions I didn't ask and should have asked is, who's going to pay for this Oncotype DX test and who's going to pay for the BRCA test? I was fortunate in that my insurance covered it, but that's not always true for a lot of these tests. And so part of the dilemma is not just a patient understanding what tests might be applicable, but trying to understand the financial complexity of our healthcare system and who's going to end up paying for things. So one of the problems, and I'm going to really put my patient hat on for a minute, is the myriad of choices you face. I immediately, despite running a cancer diagnostic lab, went out and Googled everything I possibly could find. And one of the things you discover is there's abundance of information. The problem is the quality of that information. Back to the point on what's the bias of the author, what's the bias of the site, why are they sharing it with you? Even as smart as I am and as engaged in healthcare as I am, it's really hard at times to figure that out. And I think as a cancer survivor and a cancer patient, one of the problems, and I was fortunate in that my oncologist was extremely smart and really knew a lot, but the vast majority, 20% of the US lives in rural areas that don't have access. We're in a little bit of a bubble here in Boston. We have some of the best physicians, some of the best cancer centers. You're going to deal with physicians who are really good. That's not true all over the country, and that makes your journey as a patient really important, that you're advocating for yourself. In fact, I will say, when I went to get my biopsy done, the physician looking at my mammogram said, "Oh, we don't need to do this. You've had this spot forever." And I said, no, you're going to do it. And fortunately, I did. You have to be your own advocate. So I just encourage people to understand that patients asking questions are important. Having them be knowledgeable is really hard. And the journey is really overwhelming. A lot of the information you'll see is contradictory as in terms of what you should do. And I'm going to go back to the financial complexity for a minute. What gets paid for really depends on who insures you. You talked about the government paying for the psychiatric tests. Well, that may not be true if you are with one of the private payers. And as a patient and as a company, you really need to understand who is reimbursing and why they reimburse. I remember Oncotype DX, it took them years of studies to get reimbursed by payers. The payers are rightly so skeptical, having been on that side. You really have to, and I was applauding Karen for her comment that she went early to the payers to say, what information are you looking for? A lot of companies don't do that, and that's a mistake, because what they're looking for is very different, as she pointed out, than what the FDA is looking for. What amazes me now is the number of tools that are being developed for physicians, somewhat for patients, but much more for physicians, and the debate that goes on this. You have ASCA's value framework, of which there's been a huge set of outpouring, a lot from pharmacy, about the quality of what's there. You have the National Comprehensive Cancer Network's evidence blocks. You have Drug Abacus from Memorial Sloan Kettering. You have the European Society for Medical Oncology Clinical Benefit Scale. All of those trying to say what is a value treatment. And it's understandable, therefore, why patients and physicians have a hard time figuring that out, because their conclusions are all radically different. And the question is, they all use different judgment mechanisms. And how do you figure out what is value? And at the point at which prices of drugs are increasing, it is critical that some of the right decisions are made, because with high deductible health plans now, the consumer ends up paying a lot of money for some of these drugs. In fact, there's some, the specialty drugs and the cancer drugs, they're saying that by 2020, half of the drug costs could be just from a few of the very expensive cancer treatments. I'd go back to, one other example I'll give you. This has created business opportunities. I will tell you, it is, often about, can you make money? But there's an organization here in the Boston area, Strata Oncology, offering free genomics sequencing to patients. Now, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it to get the data. Very smart way to do it. But for all those patients, and their target market is the hospitals that aren't here in Boston, that don't have access to that. I know if you go to Mass General, they will do your genomic sequencing. And they're offering these tests free to patients who wouldn't normally get it. But the cost is, to that patient is that you end up giving them your data. And that's one of the challenges. So I do think this world of precision medicine is exciting, but it is daunting as a breast cancer survivor. And I'm sure it's daunting for physicians, but even more so when you're on that other end of that really hard word to hear that you have cancer. I think right now precision medicine is still not fully evolved. I think it's at very early stages. I'm fortunate to be one who benefited from some of the early successes, but I think, and I'm a believer, but I think we have a long way to go.
Professor Newhouse.
Well, I live in the complexity of the financing world, and I wish I knew more than I know about the regulatory world, because I think that's very important, and I suspect most of you know more about it than I do, but I will plunge in anyway. So I want to take as a jumping off point the recent estimate of the cost of bringing a drug to market. And it's a controversial estimate, but the estimate is $2.5 billion. And you may say, well, that's too high, but it's still going to, whatever number it is, it's a big number. And the current regulatory process is just a hoop that to get a drug to market, a company has to go through, and therefore has to recover that fixed cost. And therefore, if there's a small market for the drug, the unit prices are going to be high. So if there's a lot of drugs with a lot of small markets, there's going to be a lot of drugs with high unit prices. If you just do the arithmetic, if you have a $100,000 a year drug, and there's 1 in 10,000 insured people that take that drug, that adds $100 a year to a family premium, or any insurance premium. So you can multiply that out, and you get to where people are going to say, gee, maybe I'll do without. And in the sense of, or maybe I won't pay the taxes. I'll come to that in a bit. The corollary is if the company can't recoup that fixed cost, the drug doesn't get to the market. So the conclusion that logic leads me to is that the fixed cost has to come down, or we're completely in a box, or maybe we're in the aquarium. And there was a recent article by Bob Coker and Brian Roberts in the New England Journal where they just tossed out a number that they thought the cost of bringing a drug to market could be reduced 90%, and the time in development 50%. They said if approval focused on fundamental safety and efficacy with strong post-market surveillance. They didn't really say where those percentages came from or provide any justification, and it's not clear to me what exactly they have in mind. But when I think about the regulatory process, at least for large market drugs, my mind goes back to Sidney Farber and empirical basis of drug testing. So we have something of a close to a uniform prior over whether something will be effective. Let's leave safety aside for the moment. And we try it in patients, and it either does work or doesn't work. But the essence of precision medicine, as I understand it, is actually we have a lot of theory that should inform our priors about whether this drug is going to work, which in principle, one would think should modify what kind of data and process we would want to bring a drug to market. I mean, that, to me, is how I interpret the reducing the cost of bringing a drug to market 90%, and then strong post-market surveillance. That may be off, but again, I think the regulatory process has to somehow be modified to account for what we know already about the likelihood that the drug will work. And then I'd like to come back to the issue of paying for it in the sense of disparities. And I think the high unit prices, Gail alluded to, will your insurance pay for it, which heads into this. But I'd just like to take the case of Sovaldi and how the Medicare program treats Sovaldi and how the Illinois Medicaid program treats Sovaldi. So set aside private insurance. These are two big public programs. So Medicare will cover Sovaldi if there's any hepatitis C infection. The Illinois Medicaid program will cover it if you're Medivir class 4 or greater, which basically means you have cirrhosis. In Medicare, there's no limit on coverage for life expectancy. In the Illinois Medicaid program, you have to have a life expectancy of greater than 12 months, or it won't be covered. In Medicare, Sovaldi will be covered even if you're using alcohol or opiates. In the Medicaid program in Illinois, you can't have any evidence of substance abuse in the last 12 months. And finally, in the Medicare program, if you're reinfected, you can still have access to the drug. In the Illinois Medicaid program, you get one shot in a lifetime. So if you take it, you go back on the street, you get reinfected, you're out of luck. Sovaldi's obviously poster child for an expensive drug, and I suspect we could see the kind of disparities that I just talked about arise with other expensive drugs. So, and again, I don't have the answer on how to change the regulatory process, but I do think we're headed toward a dead end as science is developing, given the current regulatory process.
Great. So thank you, Joe, and thank you, Carrie and Gail. So I'm going to make a few remarks, and then we'll start with some discussions. We heard a very inspiring talk this morning about the possibilities and just really the sort of superhuman nature of what Karen pulled off in terms of getting this diagnosis, figuring it out, all the way to where things are. And what you've heard over the last 15 minutes or so is sort of brings you down from that high, right? Yeah. Like, that was pretty exciting, and now you're like, oh my God, how's this gonna work? And I think what is happening is, to use a cliche, we are sort of, I think, at the dawn of a new way of thinking about medicine, and the landscape is coming into view. And the fact that there is sunlight is exciting, but then you realize the difficult terrain ahead. The public is not yet clear on what this is, whether they should care about it, how this prioritizes with everything else. There's a lot of skepticism in the media about what's driving it. You heard from Gail, also from Carrie, this notion of, so let's talk about the money that's behind it, and is it money that's driving it? And my take is money's always driving most things. That's not a distinguishing feature. The question, I mean, I'm not saying that's a critically important question. The fundamental question is it going to benefit patients, and are we going to be able to pay for it, right? And that is a set of questions that we have not even begun to answer. And then what you heard from Joe was that we have a regulatory mechanism and a payment scheme for healthcare services and drugs and that clearly are not fit for purpose for this new age that we're about to enter. It's not going to work if we don't make some fundamental changes, but no one has a clear answer on how to make those fundamental changes. And I guess one last comment, and then I want to just sort of delve in a little bit more on one specific issue. You know, people often talk about, I listened to Joe talk about the Medicare versus Illinois Medicaid. And I think most of us sitting here think, like, oh my God, for the Illinois Medicaid program. Like, you basically have to have cirrhosis. You get one shot. It just seems completely unacceptable. Except if you think about it from the state government's point of view, Sovaldi or teachers? That's the trade-off. And if that's the trade-off, then you're going to think hard about when you pay for Sovaldi. And it is not that there are bad people out there trying to withhold Sovaldi from people with Hep C. I think that's the wrong way to think about this. You get the incentives that state Medicaid directors are facing, that private insurance companies are facing, and at the same time, you completely get the perspective of the patient. And I think we are in a box, and we have to find a way out of this box. There are, in my mind, no evildoers. We just have people with very legitimate competing interests, and we have to figure out a way forward. I want to actually go one step in a slightly different direction and talk about, let's say we figure out the science. Not that we figure out the science because it's not a destination, but let's say we make a lot of progress on science of the testing. We generate a whole lot of new knowledge about when the testing is appropriate. We figure out ways of paying for both the development and the tests, all the complexity you heard about. Let's say we're 5, 10, 15 years down the road. How do we then translate all of that knowledge and all that policy stuff into direct improvements in patient care? And there's actually a long history of trying to do this that has taught us that that last step, which we think is like the little thing that at the end we'll figure it all out and then doctors will just do this, turns out over and over again to be maybe the hardest step of the whole thing, right? And you guys have all heard the notion it takes 17 years for innovation to diffuse. I'm pretty skeptical of that number, but the bottom line is that it is not that we sort of come up with the knowledge and the technology and we figure out how to pay for it, and then all of a sudden the next day everybody's using it appropriately. There's a very long lag. And one of the reasons why there is a very long lag is that physicians, practicing physicians, and those of you in the audience who have or are will appreciate this, are inundated with information, inundated with data, and they have no idea how to navigate this sort of new dawn of precision medicine. And I talk to my colleagues about precision medicine, and on one hand you hear people saying, well, haven't I always been trying to do precision medicine? Like, I'm always trying to customize treatments. I don't give a generic treatment to every patient. But then when you start talking about the issues of, well, every time you start an SSRI, should you do a genetic test? You very quickly overwhelm people's ability to both keep up with the knowledge, understand the underlying science, and know when to use it. And so the point I want to just spend 2 minutes on is talking about how do we fix that part of the problem. And if we were having this conversation 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I would have said, this is going to be incredibly hard because much of the American healthcare system is primarily still based on paper. Right? 6 years ago, 2009, 2010, the data were that about 20% of doctors were using an electronic health record, about 10% of hospitals were using an electronic health record. And so when most of the knowledge and most of the data is written on paper, little cards like this that I've been taking notes on, it's going to be very hard to figure out how to turn all this incredible knowledge that the science and the scientists are generating into clinical practice. So I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is we have made massive progress in the last 5 years on information technology adoption and use in America. That 20% of physicians, it's probably now closer to 80%. Right? That's a very big shift in a very short time period. The 10% of hospitals that were using an electronic health record in 2009, that number is probably closer to 80 to 85% of hospitals now have electronic health records. So phenomenal progress in the underlying technology base of the American healthcare system, the information technology base. So that's terrific. And so then the question is, well, is that enough? Are we there? Are we going to be able to? Do this? And I want to just couple of notes of caution of how hard it is, even when you get to technology. So then the logic becomes, this is really simple, right? You basically, somebody's seeing a patient, and I'm going to stick with the SSRI example, not because I think that's actually scientifically valid, but let's use that. Let's say there was a science behind that was very good. You'd say, well, you just create a clinical decision support tool, an alert that says to the doctor when they're about to prescribe an SSRI or some other antidepressant, hey, have you thought about doing this test? If you haven't, go do this test, come back, change your treatment. We've been trying that stuff in healthcare for about 10 years, and it mostly doesn't work. So even if you have the knowledge and the science and it's really well delineated, and even if you get to the information technology infrastructure underlying how you do clinical decision support, there's some nice studies from the Brigham that David Bates and others have done that show that when you give physicians, now this is much easier, I mean, this idea of genetic testing is complicated. Take something really simple like drug-drug interactions. There's some very nice data from the Brigham that if you show physicians drug-drug interactions, they override it between 90 and 95% of the time.
Wow.
Right? There's none of the complexity of what we're talking about here. This is just like, hey, you shouldn't give these two drugs together, and doctors are like, yeah, thanks a lot.
Wow.
It should raise some fundamental questions about why does that happen. These are not bad people who want to hurt their patients, right? It's not that they don't care. There's a series of things, I think, that fundamentally lead to that, and I'll lay out a couple of them. One of the issues is that a lot of these alerts, a lot of this stuff, when physicians get it, they don't feel clinically relevant. They feel off. And if you keep getting alerted to stuff that's off, that doesn't really make sense, you essentially tune out. And even when there are alerts that are useful, we all know this, right? Sort of signal noise issues. So much noise, you stop paying attention to the signal. And so designing systems that are really parsimonious about how you do this and when the science is good enough to begin to do this is very difficult, and we have not figured it out. Another part is around the issue of working with the physician workflow. Once you've made a decision to do something, and then 20 minutes later you get alerted that maybe you shouldn't, that's much, much harder at that point because you've already gone down a path. And so figuring out when to share information with physicians, with other providers, and how to deliver that information in a way that's likely to get them to think more critically about clinical practice has not really worked out, and we haven't figured out how to do it. And so even on very simple things like getting doctors to prescribe more evidence-based treatments, avoiding drug-drug interactions, we have not really solved the problem of how you go from having information technology to how you actually change behavior and how you actually change practice. And so if we haven't done it for what I think is much simpler stuff, it's going to be much harder on this. I want to just finish off on what I think is a more positive note, which is none of this to say that we're not going to be able to figure this out. I'm actually extremely optimistic that healthcare and medicine will look very different down the road than it does now. And you say, well, what do you mean down the road? Whether it's going to take 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, whether it's going to be a relatively straight line or a very curvy path, whether we're going to spend massive amounts of money doing things wrong or doing things right, that's what we get to determine. I have no doubt at some point down the road, we're going to make a lot of progress on solving these issues. We'll have a new regulatory framework. Patients will understand the value of this stuff. We will understand the financial issues and the clinical issues much better. I'm very optimistic. There is just a long path between here and there. And what we do over the next few years, I think, is going to really determine how quickly we realize the promise of precision medicine. So thank you all for listening. And what I'm going to do before, let me just do a quick round of applause for our speakers. So we have a good amount of time. We have about 40 minutes. I'm going to start off with some questions. We were having a really interesting discussion just before this panel started. And Carrie, I'm going to ask you to begin.
Yeah, I forgot that point.
No, it's fine. She said, should I mention this? I said, if you don't, I'm going to ask you a question about it.
Okay.
So one of the tension points, you've heard lots of tension points. One of the tension points is public health versus precision medicine. And I say versus not because I necessarily believe that they are at conflict, but there's plenty of people who do believe they are at conflict. This idea that what we really need to be doing is investing in social determinants of health, public health interventions, how to do the most good for the most people, and real skepticism about whether this stuff is the right way to go or not. So I actually would love it if all of you would take some shot at that. But Carrie, if we can have you start.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to cast doubt on whether this is a good way to spend public money after Karen speaks. I mean, you absolutely want to support what she's doing and people like her. But at the same time, I do think it's important to note that there was pushback from the public health community to the Precision Medicine Initiative. And in fact, Sandro Galea, the dean of the BU School of Public Health, wrote in the New England Journal that he said he had concerns about the unstinting focus on precision medicine by trusted spokespeople for health. He said that's a mistake and a distraction from the goal of producing a healthier population. So, I mean, and he sees precision medicine as dominating the NIH agenda, and he says that the potential is clear, but the number of people who you could point to who have actually benefited from it are very small. So he says we should be clear that we're investing in potential, but there are other investments that we could be making in, say, fighting poverty and its terrible health effects that might actually be better bang for the buck. So, I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily so zero-sum, but I think it's an important point to make. And I also tend to be a hopeless optimist, and I would say that actually one of my favorite NIH projects that's going on right now is they've put out an RFP for it's $174 million that they're putting into basically figuring out why exercise is so good for us. Like, if you could crack that, you would get both public health. I'm sure you'll need a lot of genomics and informatics to do it, and that would just bring both sides together.
I love it.
Are they going to address getting people to do it?
Well, you wouldn't need to if you knew why.
I'm not sure. A lot of people know
Actually, I
things
don't
that are
know.
good for them and still ignore it.
I'll say.
So Gail, you were one of the beneficiaries
I know, and I
of
was-
precision
yeah.
medicine.
Yeah.
But you understand this tension.
I do, and I was one of the beneficiaries, and that does feel good. And so as one of those that have benefited, it's hard to not want to do it. I do think, I want to go back to a point you made that I think is important, which goes, is it going to improve outcomes? So one of the things that made Oncotype DX so successful, as an example, is they could prove it changed physicians' behavior. So they demonstrated that physicians actually didn't prescribe chemotherapy if the result was a low result that indicated that. And
Did
I
that
do,
improve survival?
it does, well, it improved targeting of chemotherapy. I'm not sure on the survival side, but at least those that didn't, from their metrics, benefit from chemotherapy weren't given the poison. And it proved physicians change behavior because of it, which I think is the important point about this. It's the so what? It's the, is this test or is this precision medicine going to change both outcomes and behavior? And I don't know that we always answer that question. A lot of times the tests are nice to know, but if they don't change what you're going to do, doesn't matter. And I think it's those kind of tests that are less valuable that we shouldn't be focusing all our time. Yeah, it's nice information, but if it doesn't change how you're going to treat me or what I should do, then, what good does it do me? I look at something like 23andMe, and it's really interesting. But what does it change about my behavior or what I do? And that would be the question I'd ask in terms of improving outcomes. And so I do think there's a benefit, but I think we have to ask some harder questions when we look at the value.
Joe, how do you? I mean,
I'm kind of in the same mindset. There certainly is some tension here, but there's just too much uncertainty about both social determinants and precision medicine to, I think, make any very strong statement. So, for example, Karen alluded to possible spillovers. Well, yes, I mean, I think a lot of science advances because somebody sees something from another field that can be imported into what they're doing. And that seems very likely to happen here, but who knows how big those will be. On the social determinants side, I think we're even further behind with the science. We certainly know poverty is bad. We certainly know better housing can improve things. But in terms of trying to say what are proven interventions that are cost effective, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I will say there's a lot of evidence that children's health has improved, which over the last few decades, which I think the Medicaid program can fairly take some credit for, and that the states that have expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act have done better health-wise than the states that haven't. So there is, but again, how to trade off these things, I think we're very far away from being able to do that with any kind of certainty.
Great. So I'm going to actually go ahead and open it up for questions from the group. If you could just go up there. I saw lots of burgeoning interest. So we're going to go back and forth, and we'll start there. Introduce yourself, and then short question. If you want to target to a specific panel member, do so. If you want to open it broadly, that's fine.
Yeah, so I'm Gil Oman, University of Michigan, and geneticist engaged in public health and health policy for a long time. On this last problem, presented as a dilemma, I would just like to point out, as I'm sure Joe knows, that there are some resources on this question of what do we know and what can we recommend for preventive testing, and especially for community interventions. In fact, there's a meeting today and tomorrow at the CDC of the Community Preventive Services Task Force of the CDC with a very full agenda, including their annual report to Congress, which we released imminently, and many publications, and a website full of information about what is the evidence base and what is the economic analysis for community-based multimodality interventions for reducing obesity, reducing diabetes, improving bone disease, all kinds of common diseases, really common diseases and risk factors for which there are interventions. And with a concerted effort over the last 15 years or so, there's a database now, and there are efforts to translate the findings into lay language for dissemination, as well as into journal articles to try to reach the professional audience.
Yep.
So there's a chance to try to address these questions. And in some cases, we will have genetic markers that are important for responsiveness to even these kinds of interventions like exercise and better diet and all the rest. There's a study in Seattle, Scientific Wellness, led by Leroy Hood.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Anybody want to comment on that in terms of, obviously there is a lot of both interest and efforts to be more effective in our public health interventions, be more community oriented. If anybody wants to, I'm happy to.
Well, just to fantasize, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could use genetic testing to figure out who would respond to which interventions best, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Aaron Eben from the Autoimmune Registry. Dr. Jha, the description of the doctors ignoring the alerts. There's a really simple way of thinking about that, and that's, well, why don't you have somebody on the back end looking at these alerts instead of forcing the doctor? I think the doctors are put in the position of doing everything in medicine. They like that position. But I think the processes have to change. When you automate, every industry that's automated with technology has had to change the way it actually works. And I think we have to get away from this idea of a practice of medicine to a process of medicine. I'd like to hear some comments about that.
That's a great point, and let me make a couple of quick points about it. So as you might imagine, there is a back step, which is the pharmacy, right? So the pharmacy is supposed to also do that double checking. But what they find is that then the pharmacist is having to call the doctor and saying, by the way, do you know there's a drug-drug interaction? And that's a very expensive and complicated and annoying. We talk about annoying, that's even more annoying. So the idea was, well, let's head that off by just telling the doctor up front there's a drug-drug interaction, so you don't have to do all of that back-end work. And it turns out that we haven't figured out how to do that part. I completely agree with you. It is about process. I think there is very little doubt that what I think this is a short-term problem. What we've done with information technology adoption is we have now figured out all sorts of ways that we can torture doctors when they're practicing.
Yeah.
And it has become, and there's very good evidence that physicians have become far less efficient as a result. I mean, there's very few, I think, industries where technology adoption has this huge negative efficiency, but we've managed to pull that off in healthcare. I think it's going to get better, and I think it's going to get better exactly in the way that you described, is we're going to have to rethink the process by which care is delivered. We have to do some very difficult questions to answer about what is the job of the doctor, what should doctors and only doctors do. And I think what most industries have done in terms of gaining efficiency is figured out how to take a whole lot of stuff off the plate of the most expensive person using information technology as a way to support them. So I'm completely on board. On this one, it's been a tough nut to crack.
So Ashish, I wanted to comment on that
Yeah.
with a different example
Yeah.
that goes in the other direction, actually.
I like it.
So my understanding, although it could be wrong, if someone's here from Mass General, maybe they know, but is that if you're going to prescribe a second or third line antibiotic at Mass General, you have to get an ID consult.
Yep.
And so now we're involving higher people, not lower people, but we have obviously a terrible problem with overprescribing of antibiotics. And maybe someday there will be enough decision support that will say, no, you just can't do it. And if you still insist, you can talk to somebody. But that's where we are now on that front.
Yeah. No, I actually, so I practice at the West Roxbury VA, and I have the same issue, and I think it's a good thing. There are
Yeah.
certain antibiotics that I cannot prescribe without getting in. And what it does is it fosters a conversation. The ID person's like, why are you doing this? And I tell them, and then they say, you're crazy. You should be. They don't usually say I'm crazy. But then we have that discussion. So it's complicated, right? So there are not these sort of simple solutions of the decision support will help us get there. And I guess maybe that's the bigger point, Joe, is that with technology and information availability, we've had some very simplistic models of how we're going to move the ball forward. It turns out for drug-drug interactions versus changing antibiotic use, you need very different strategies.
That was my point.
That's a great point.
But can I go back to your
Please.
example on drug-drug interaction? The only one thing I'd say is I think about that patient who's waiting for the prescription, who now has the pharmacist having to get hold of a doctor who's likely off doing other things, and it extends the time of care. And, you got to go back to the patient.
Absolutely.
And that's the frustrating part,
Yeah, yeah.
is, while the process may not work, the person who benefits or suffers is the patient.
Yep.
And
Yep.
just
Great
as a
point.
friendly amendment, I was going to comment that having the consumer more engaged in that process as well, whether more of a partner to getting the proper care that fits them best,
Yeah,
rethinking the process that much,
Yep.
that we include them.
yeah.
Although
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring a counterexample. I mean, we tend to think of patient-driven as being a very good thing, but I recently did a story about the what Zach had mentioned, there's post-Angelina Jolie, lots and lots more women getting BRCA testing, lots and lots more women getting bilateral mastectomies. And then recently I wrote about a surgeon at the Brigham, Meira Golshan, who published a paper questioning whether all these bilateral mastectomies were really a good idea because, in fact, there was no survival benefit. And so, patient-driven is not always a good thing, even though we think it is.
Well, the problem is the patient doesn't always know. And so I'll give the example, how many I see some of these cancer drugs advertised on TV, and I sit there saying, is that really where I want to get my information? But it actually has proven successful for the company. If they look at the evidence,
You ask
because, you see happy people and they're all healthy, and I want that. Whether it's right for me is sort of a secondary thing. But it gets hard for the physician saying no. When a patient comes in and says, I know this will benefit me, and they're wrong because they don't have all the information. It's a tough thing.
So I have a former student who is a Canadian neonatologist, and he's been running clinical trials in Canadian NICUs where the parents are given the authority to have to approve every decision. The only thing the parents can't do is give a procedure.
Wow.
And in the clinical trials, he gets better results when the parents are in charge. And this has been the sufficient evidence. He's now apparently, he tells me, running a clinical trial at UCSF of this phenomenon. So again,
yeah.
it's maybe a finer grading than.
I'd be interested to see the difference in the American culture versus Canadian culture around if it works as successfully here. But I do think patient engagement's a good thing.
Yeah. No, and I actually buy those results. And again, there's this very interesting story that Maureen Bisignano, who, until recently ran the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, talks about a dialysis center in Sweden where essentially they turned the whole dialysis process over to the patient. And the patient can come in 24/7, it's open, they can get a key card, they walk in, and they can dialyze themselves. And what they have figured out is infection rates drop, complications drop, people's lives get dramatically better because people can hold jobs because they're not spending 6 hours or 4 hours a day, 3 days a week in a dialysis center. And everything gets better. I think, is that the right model? I don't know. It sounds great. Is this neonatology model the right model for? I don't know. It sounds really interesting. To me, the biggest issue is we do not have enough of these kinds of experiments in healthcare. We worry so much about the downside, how it could go bad, and we pay way too little attention to how mediocre things are right now.
Yeah.
And sort of that bias of the status quo, I think, is what really gets us into trouble. I am up for experimentation with the idea that sometimes experiments, actually often experiments fail. And we have to be able to live with that. Sir.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Steve Dickman from CBT Advisors, and I'm a consultant here in Cambridge. I've been tweeting about your panel, and immediately when I tweeted Carrie's soundbite about FDA isn't regulating, this is unregulated, it's the Wild West, which is of course accurate, a couple of responses came back from commenters who basically said, wait a second, there's CLIA. And FDA is not the only game in town, so I just want to relay a brief anecdote and ask the panel about whether they think there should be more regulation and whether FDA should be the agency to do it. I remember vividly in 2005 or so when Genomic Health went public, there was a scare in the market that FDA would step in and regulate. They sent a letter to Genomic Health and said we might regulate, and then in the end they didn't. And the test Oncotype DX has been wildly successful. It's never been regulated by FDA, always by CLIA. But I remember thinking in 2005, this might really be one of the last tests developed under the LDT, the lab developed test protocol, because FDA sounds like they're about to step in. And in the meantime, it's been 12 years of the status quo, 11 years of the status quo, which may or may not be better. It might be mediocre. On the other hand, somehow it's been chosen. And just to propose a controversial alternative, the market does actually regulate whether the tests work, because a lot of people get the tests and the tests don't work. People stop getting the test. I mean, there is a feedback loop there. It might not be the one that we want, but I want to ask the panelists, any of you, all of you, what do we want, and is FDA the right agency to do it?
So my immediate response would be, I want transparency, the same way that my food is labeled. I would like to know exactly how accurate the test is and what that means for me. And it doesn't sound like that always happens.
Yeah, and having run a lab and being part of the Medicare advisory panel on lab diagnostics, the concept of the FDA regulating lab-developed tests as a former CEO is a little frightening. But I will tell you that CLIA doesn't regulate tests in the same way the FDA does. They regulate how the lab is run, but they're not really doing the same thing. I go back to what is the sensitivity, specificity. Thank you. I can't speak today. And do physicians understand that? I'm not sure
And patients.
right. And because not every the tests aren't all equal. So good points.
Yeah.
Just one quick little side story. There was a nice paper. It was just a letter to the editor in the JAMA Internal Medicine sometime in the last year. And I was one of the study participants, where they went around and asked residents and attendings. They gave them sensitivity and specificity of tests.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and they
And
quizzed
said-
it.
They're
Yeah.
And then
bad
they
at the
just
math.
said, okay, so the test comes back positive. What are the chances that somebody has a disease?
Right.
And it was a disaster. I mean, it was just an unmitigated disaster. Like, I think, 2 or 3 people out of
Right.
40 got it right. I really hope I was one of them, but I can't remember. I got it right. No, I no.
They were the economics majors.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Okay, sir, over there.
Hi.
We read about it.
Oh, you were. Sorry, Zach, I missed that.
First of all, we're that bad. 50% of you got it wrong. So this was,
Okay.
this actually is interesting.
come to it.
No? Ah, there. So I want this audience to go through the thought experiment. You have a sheesh. We're worried about whether he's a zombie or not. And I'm telling you, the zombie disease is 1 in 1,000. And we have a test that's 100% sensitive for zombie disease, but it's 5% specific. So it has a false positive rate of 5%. And so, but it's only 1 in 1,000. The zombies haven't taken over yet. And so the question is, we found that Ashish is in fact positive by this test, and that's a pretty good test. We would love to have a test that's 100% sensitive and 95% specific. What's the likelihood that he in fact is a zombie? So I'm not going to torture you because I don't have the time, unfortunately, because I do enjoy that. But here it goes. So you have 1,000 people. If it's 1 in 1,000 disease, there'll be 1 true positive. If 5% false positive, so that's 50 out of 1,000 are false positive. So you'll have 51 positives, of which only 1 is a true positive. So it's basically 2% chance that he is a zombie. And so this is particularly problematic for rare diseases. So about half of the doctors that we polled that, in this group, Raj, who's in the audience, actually ran the study. Half the doctors got it right, and half of the doctors got it wildly wrong. They were about 90%. But the real irony is the same question had been asked in a New England Journal study 30 years before, and the doctors performed exactly the same way. So we haven't made any progress.
So much for 30 years of teaching evidence-based medicine to physicians. Sir.
Hi, I'm a research scientist from Purdue University, and my background is mathematics and statistics. And my problem is I really don't understand physicians, but I work with healthcare data. So in line with the comment that you made about the decision support tools, there is a new approach in medicine which tries to engage the physicians by looking at the practice of other physicians. For example, how did another particular physician or hospital treated people with certain diseases similar to the patient that is being treated by this physician, which is called collective experience. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts in that regard? Like, what do you think about the success of that approach? Particularly Dr. Ashish or anyone else can comment.
Well, let me start it, but I'd love to hear other folks. I mean, so there's no doubt that physicians are human beings, not zombies. And as human beings, we're social animals. And as social animals, we are influenced by peer behavior, right? And there's very good evidence on things like if you look at why do some organizations do better than others on taking up beta blockers for heart attack patients, having a clinical champion that physicians really trust makes a huge difference. And as a provider, when you see an alert pop up on the electronic health record, your brain says, some bean counter put this up, I don't know what it means, but I'm annoyed and I've got to get through this appointment, and you just hit, override. But a colleague that you trust says, that's not how I do it. You're interested. You say, tell me more about how you do it, and then you walk through that. Now, that one-on-one conversation, people have tried that as a way to change physician behavior. Very hard, just very intensive. I think I'm not aware of a lot of evidence that this sort of collective experience stuff moves the needle more, but I'd bet on the idea that it probably does. And in fact, that's a lot of how marketers who want physician behavior to change, prescribe this, don't prescribe that, have tried to go at it by identifying who are the kind of influencers and how do you get information to physicians that says, hey, you do this, your colleagues do this. It's a very interesting thing, but it's like getting into a new way of thinking about influencing behavior. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything on that. Okay, sir.
You're touching on something that I wanted to comment on. Having spent roughly 30 years in the aerospace industry, which went through paroxysms of process work, I just want to put out a word of caution about adopting process. It has to be done very carefully when you're reducing to practice clinical things so that you get it right and you don't end up in places where you find the practitioners always working on workarounds full time. I think of the retail industry was one of the first industries that used data mining to reduce to practice a lot of things. And you drove the soul out of Main Street with Walmart, and you go to Home Depot, and you get all the downside of that. So when you do this in medicine, let's make sure we don't take the soul out of it. Remove the nuance that engaged people to adopt or to get interested in medicine in the first place.
I could actually comment on that. In terms of, absolutely, that one can't help but agree with you, but at the same time, in terms of data mining in medicine, one area where actually Zach has totally converted me is that it drives me crazy that my patient data is not mined more for my potential benefit, and that in fact HIPAA and other constraints get in the way of a free flow of data mining that would be incredibly powerful, I think, in terms of being able to figure out with my genetic profile, with my phenotype, what would be best for me. Let's look at all the other patients who are like me and see what worked with them, and then give me the best treatment. So in fact, I would like to see more data mining in medicine, having been converted by Zach.
Gail, I'm going to just put you on the spot. I mean, you've played lots of roles in healthcare, but certainly you described very eloquently your role as a patient. Do you want more data mining? Less? Different?
I agree personally that data mining is critical, because how else is the science going to improve except from learning? But one of the challenges about data mining, so I'll give you cancer as an example. A very sophisticated hospital system in New Jersey is trying to figure out the outcomes on cancer. And the problem you have is even with an EHR, a lot of the data you need for the outcomes is in the physician note field. It's not codified. And so now there's an intensive effort to try to take that data. You have to marry it with billing data, which is in a different system, and try to pull it all together to figure out, what are the outcomes like, as well as what tests were ordered, all of that. And so to get the true longitudinal data, to some degree, a lot of it is not easily accessible today.
So, Joe, I'm going to ask you a question. You can build on that, but I'm going to ask you also a very specific question. So what Gail describes is hard, expensive. Why should organizations go through the process of doing all of that? Do we have the right incentive structure to basically get organizations to say, we're going to invest in natural language processing. We're going to invest in building the IT infrastructure that lets all that happen. Do we have that part of it right? Should we do that? Is there stuff to tweak there? And then what else you were going to say?
I was going to say something else. But, the standard incentives are the market incentives where we have competitors and the better mousetrap wins. And unfortunately, in healthcare, there's a lot of concentration, partly to bear the cost of investing in capital equipment you need. But that is obviously going to dull the incentives to be the excellent organization or to invest the amount of capital you need. So that's about as well as I can do with that. I was going to mention a somewhat related idea on patient involvement, but it's not exactly data mining, which is N-of-1 trials, where if you have a drug that quickly, I'm blocking on the word, no, not benefits, it basically gets out of the system. You can say you can do a protocol where you randomize patient to drug this week, drug not that week, drug off, et cetera. And you can observe how the patient does. And this, it's not going to work in every case, obviously, but it is a way to try to accommodate the heterogeneity across patients in how they respond to drugs. And then you can even potentially build up to what amounts to a synthetic trial. If you say you take patients with observable characteristics, say 25 to 35-year-old females, and now you have a bunch of them that have been on these N-of-1 trials, and you can actually mimic a standard trial.
Yeah. May I add one thing to the incentive question, if I can, because I think you make good points, which is a lot of the motivation now to get that information has to do with reimbursement, as when we're looking at reimbursement based on performance as opposed to event or transaction. And a lot of organizations are trying to figure out, how do I take risk if I don't understand if what I'm doing is delivering a better outcome? And I think the discussion about performance-based metrics is creating more of a demand for outcome-based results that, people are discovering don't easily exist.
Right. I love it. Okay, great. I think we're over there next.
Hi, my name's Dave Arlett. I'm an instructor at Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences in the Biomedical Informatics program. Hello, Gail.
I was going to say, you might know this.
Yeah. After attending last year's conference, at about the same time, my brother John entered into the final phases of his struggle with Parkinson's disease, and I was presented with a stack of medical records from his doctors and hospitals and so forth, that it became my task, since I knew a little bit of something, to read through it and come up with a summary for his emergency room doctors. After I returned, I started developing a application, it's called MetaPass, that would allow families to maintain these records on their own using Java and actually Excel spreadsheets. And I wanted to respond or question something in the opening comment from Gary Goldberg, which was that doctors seem to feel that these medical records were somehow adequate as opposed to doing actual genetic testing. So for one thing, if you do genetic testing, then the family members are going to be engaged in maintaining these records because they may have some importance to the next generation and the generation after that. But in the research for my paper, which is unpublished, I looked into what the actual statutes were about maintaining medical records. And throughout the United States, typically, and you probably all know this, it's 7 years for doctors and 7 years for hospitals. In some states, it's as low as 5 years. Massachusetts, to its esteem, is the only state that has hospitals maintain medical records for 30 years. And so I guess my question is in terms of research, above and beyond meeting the minimum legal requirements, is 7 years enough?
Carrie?
Yeah.
Or Gail, 7 years,
I think it depends. I'm not sure what the right time frame is. And it is tough sometimes for medical records, because now, remember, a lot of them are paper. So they're not really very accessible. Even if you wanted to go back 6 years, I'm not sure a lot of organizations would even be able to find them.
It's archived in some warehouse.
Yeah. Go to that warehouse somewhere and look through the boxes. But I think you make one other point that I think is really important, which is about patient ownership of medical records. Yeah. And, I think one of the major voids right now is patients not taking more ownership of their records and leaving it up to the different providers. Because, and I think if patients really do step up, not that I think you need to necessarily have it in physical, tangible form, although it's really important. And I kept all my cancer ones, I have a notebook because it was still paper. But I think we need to be more proactive about getting our medical information and sharing it.
So can I ask a question about that? I'm going to ask Carrie too, but both of you. So we've been talking about the idea of personal health records, people keep maintaining it. I think there's nobody I've met who says that's a bad idea. Right. And yet, it hasn't really happened. Like, patients have, I talk to people at Partners and Care Group who all have patients, and it's so difficult to get patients to sign up and use this stuff.
Well, that's because it's only for your system. So I don't happen to only go to one system. If I go to Leahy and I go to Partners and I go...
But Google tried this. And
there's one big outlier, Ashish, which is Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, has something like 2/3 take-up of personal health records. Everybody else seems to be down in single digits, as far as I can tell.
Everything is different in Northern California.
No, not the rest of California.
But I would just add, you reminded me of way back in 2000 when the human genome was processed, was first sequenced. A lot of people said, pretty soon we're all going to be carrying our genomes around on a little CD, right? Which is now very antiquated. We'd probably have or be in the cloud. But still, it is interesting that we have not actually taken that up. And I think, speaking from the point of view of a member of the general public, I would say, well, you haven't made it easy for me yet. You haven't given me the one. And I think that's where the blue button, talk of the blue button comes in. Like, we're still waiting for that one place in the cloud where all of our medical data can go. And that could launch a rant about how far behind medical electronics are to
A little bit of comic relief. This discussion in my research actually goes back to the 1950s when there was a discussion about wearing medical bracelets for people with diabetes and epilepsy, and it was determined that this was really the patient's responsibility to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just if I would gladly be implanted with a chip
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
my medical record.
Yeah,
If
no,
I thought it was useful and I didn't have to do anything to it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Sir, last question.
My name is John Birch. I'm an angel investor in Kansas City, a member of a group called the Mid-America Angels. And for a year and a half or two, I've been researching the concepts that you're all addressing here today. And we're working on what the health record bank concept, in which, and it might be called something like this, POEMS, Patient's Own Electronic Medical System. It would operate like a bank in which we as consumers open an account. The bank, as our intermediary, would collect all of our data from all the different places, would curate it, and it needs a lot of curation, but would get it from every place that HIPAA enables you, allows you to get it, and then continues to maintain that. And makes that then available to your doctors, and of course also to researchers, with patient consent would be built right into opening the account. So the problem of reconsenting for this, that, or the other research is all taken care of, implicitly. But I want to, monetizing this was a problem for Google Health, although they were not trying what I'm talking about, and neither did Microsoft. And there are probably 24 little patient-centered banks popping up around the country right now that I'm aware of. There's at least one or two here in Boston, trying to monetize it completely on the basis of patient value. Patients pay for the account, but they can't possibly cover the costs. And that will certainly never scale, that business model, financial model will never scale up to 200, 300 million Americans. We're working on one that will scale. And the key there is who's at the top of the data chain. Who's at the top of the data food chain? It's pharma, isn't it? Certainly among the inhabitants up there. So my question really is an economic one. If that kind of data, where we have, let's just dream here for a moment, not just longitudinal data for 2 or 3 years, but we have longitudinal womb to tomb, let's say in 20 years we could begin to actually have that. Would access to that kind of data improve the preclinical drug discovery research, as well as therefore enable the clinical research that's done at pharma to become so much more efficient and so much more streamlined that it might bring down some of those fixed costs that you're talking about? That's one of probably 100 questions that I do have to address, but that's very focused on what you were saying.
Is that a good strategy for getting that 90% reduction in the fixed costs? Or?
You're assuming you have genetic information?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm not enough of I'm an economist, not a scientist, so I mean, it sounds reasonable to me, but what do I know?
No, the point is, I think, right, I think the really important point that Joe's making is that we do not have the magic pathway to doing that 90% reduction. But we've got to experiment with things like this, and there's good reason to believe that stuff like that can make a difference. But does anybody on this panel or anyone in this room know that that's how we're going to reduce costs of drug development by 90% or even 50%? I think we don't. Yeah. Let me just take the last question because we are about out of time. And you, yes, sir.
Thank you. I think I stand between everyone and lunch, so I'll be brief. My name is Zeb Kimmel. I'm the CEO of a local startup company, Atlas 5D. I came up because of the discussion about personal health records, which was an area of research of mine when I was a postdoctoral fellow here at HMS, and later a member of the healthcare technology practice at McKinsey. And what appears to be the case is that PHR adoption is driven by the presence of tactical tools for patients like refills or appointment bookings. That appears to be what drove the success of Kaiser and the failure of Google. So just a brief comment. I have no question. Thank you for the panel.
That's a fantastic point, which is that the reason I use my iPhone is because it's awfully useful for a bunch of stuff I want to do. And the reason why people use PHRs is because it's useful for things they were going to do anyway. So let me quickly finish up, and then I'll turn it over to Zach. I think what you heard from today's discussion was a laying out of the terrain of the issues and challenges in front of us. The only way we're going to get into trouble is by ignoring these issues and plowing ahead without realizing that these are going to be stumbling blocks. Stumbling blocks are not a problem. You just have to identify them and you have to address them. We've got to figure out how to get patients, consumers, the general public to better understand what we're trying to do with precision medicine. Financial incentives are not fundamentally a problem, and they're actually the way the world works, but understanding what effects they have on decisions, how we can separate good science from bad science, those are ongoing challenges, and we're going to have to continue to struggle with those. And then figuring out a way for the regulation and the payment system to constantly evolve and experiment with new approaches so that this new dawn can really be realized, I think is one of the biggest challenges. So thank you all for a very interesting discussion, great conversation among the panelists.